The hum of conversation and the clinking of plates filled the air as Marcus sat in his usual corner booth at the small diner on Main Street. It wasn't fancy, but it had charm, the kind of place where everyone felt like family. Marcus liked that. It was where he could take a break from the chaos of the world and just enjoy a warm meal. The air smelled of coffee and freshly cooked bacon, comforting scents that wrapped around him like a blanket. But tonight, something felt different. He noticed her the moment he walked in. A young waitress, probably in her early 20s, with tired eyes and a weary smile. Her uniform was neatly pressed, but there was an unmistakable heaviness in her movements. She greeted customers with politeness, yet her voice carried a fragility that was hard to ignore. Marcus watched as she moved from table to table, her hands working quickly, but her shoulders drooping with the weight of something unseen. He hadn't planned to stay long. His order was simple: coffee, black, and a slice of pie. But as the minutes passed, Marcus found himself captivated by the young woman's presence. It wasn't in a romantic way, no. He was simply drawn to the unspoken story she seemed to carry. There was something deeply human about the way she tried to mask her pain with practiced cheerfulness. When she came to his table to take his order, he noticed the faint redness around her eyes, as though she'd been crying recently. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrote down his request, and though she smiled at him, it didn't reach her eyes. Marcus couldn't help but wonder what had brought her to this point, what burdens she was carrying that made her smile feel so brittle. As the evening wore on, the diner grew quieter. Customers trickled out one by one, leaving the waitress more room to breathe, but instead of relaxing, she seemed to grow more anxious. Marcus caught glimpses of her wiping at her eyes when she thought no one was looking, her expression a mix of frustration and despair. Something inside him stirred, a quiet, persistent voice telling him not to let this moment pass. Marcus wasn't the kind of man to pry into other people's lives. He believed in minding his own business, keeping to himself. But tonight, something felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant to do something, to reach out in some way, even if it was small. He watched as she disappeared into the kitchen, returning a few moments later with a stack of plates. Her steps faltered slightly, as though the weight of her emotions was becoming too much to bear. And then, for just a second, their eyes met. She quickly looked away, but not before Marcus saw the pain etched in her gaze, a pain that was impossible to ignore. The bill arrived with a quiet, "Here you go, sir," and she moved on before he could respond. Marcus stared at the check for a moment, his mind racing. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but he knew what it felt like to carry a burden alone. He'd been there once, lost, struggling, and unsure of what the future held. And he knew how much it had meant when someone had shown him kindness, even when they didn't have to. Reaching into his pocket, Marcus pulled out a pen and a scrap of paper. He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering above the page. What could he say that wouldn't feel intrusive or overbearing? Finally, he began to write, his words simple but heartfelt. As he placed the note under the edge of his coffee cup and slid a few bills beneath it, Marcus felt a strange sense of peace. He didn't know if the note would make a difference, but he hoped it would. Sometimes, all it took was a small act of kindness to remind someone they weren't alone. As he left the diner, the young waitress picked up the check and the note beneath it. Her tired eyes scanned the words, and for a moment, her breath caught. She looked up, searching for the man who had written it, but he was already gone. What Marcus didn't know was how those few words would set off a chain of events that neither of them could have imagined. The night outside the diner was cool, and Marcus pulled his jacket tighter around him as he walked back to his car. His mind lingered on the young waitress, her tired eyes, and the note he left behind. He didn't know if she'd even read it, let alone take it to heart, but he hoped it would mean something to her. Maybe it would remind her that people cared, even strangers like him. Driving home, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that his small act had been more significant than he realized. He thought about his own struggles years ago, the times when he had felt lost and invisible. Back then, it had been a stranger's unexpected kindness that had given him hope, a simple gesture that had reminded him of his worth. That memory had stayed with him, shaping the way he tried to move through the world. Meanwhile, back at the diner, the young waitress, whose name was Emily, stood frozen at the counter, staring at the note in her hands. The words were simple, but they hit her like a wave. "I see you. You're stronger than you think. Don't give up." Tears blurred her vision as she reread the message, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't expected anyone to notice her pain, let alone a customer she'd barely spoken to. For weeks, she'd been drowning under the weight of her problems, feeling like she was on the verge of breaking. And yet, here was this note, this lifeline, from someone who didn't even know her. Emily slipped the note into her pocket and finished her shift in a daze. As she wiped down tables and stacked chairs, her mind kept returning to the man who had left her the message. She remembered his kind eyes and the quiet way he had observed everything around him. He hadn't said much, but something about his presence had been calming. When her shift finally ended, Emily walked to her beat-up car in the parking lot. The cold night air stung her cheeks, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts were consumed by the note and the unexpected glimmer of hope it had sparked. She couldn't remember the last time someone had offered her such genuine kindness. Driving home, Emily's mind wandered to the reasons she had been crying earlier. Life had been relentlessly hard lately. Between her overdue rent, mounting bills, and her younger brother's medical expenses, she felt like she was constantly running uphill with no end in sight. Her parents had passed away years ago, leaving her to care for her brother, Ethan, who had been diagnosed with a chronic illness. At just 22 years old, Emily felt like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. She parked her car outside the small, run-down apartment she shared with Ethan. The lights were still on inside, and she could see him sitting by the window with his sketchpad. Ethan loved to draw, and it was one of the few things that brought him joy despite his condition. Emily forced a smile as she walked through the door, determined not to let her brother see how much she was struggling. "Hey, Ethan said with a grin, looking up from his drawing. "How was work?" "It was fine," she lied, setting her bag down on the counter. "Busy, as always." Ethan studied her for a moment, his smile fading slightly. "You look tired." "I'm okay," she assured him, ruffling his hair. "Just a long day." Later that night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Emily sat at the small kitchen table with a note in front of her. She traced the words with her fingers, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Who was this man, and why had he chosen to reach out to her? The next day, Marcus went about his usual routine, but he couldn't stop thinking about the waitress. He didn't know why her pain had struck such a chord with him, but it had. He found himself wondering about her life, the challenges she was facing, and whether his note had made any difference. At the diner, Emily went through her shift with a renewed sense of determination. The note had reminded her that she wasn't as invisible as she felt. Maybe, just maybe, there was still hope for her to find a way out of the darkness. As the days passed, Emily began to notice small changes in herself. She smiled more often, even if it was just a little. She found herself opening up to her coworkers, something she hadn't done in months. And though her problems hadn't disappeared, she felt a tiny spark of hope that she could handle them. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to do something more. The note had been a turning point for her, and she wanted to pay it forward somehow. She began brainstorming ways to help others, even in small ways. Maybe she could volunteer at a local shelter or donate her time to a community center. One evening, as she sat with Ethan, she told him about the note. "It's crazy, isn't it?" she said, showing him the small piece of paper. "How a stranger's words can make such a big difference." Ethan studied the note, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Maybe it's a sign," he said. "Like maybe you're supposed to do something with this." "What do you mean?" Emily asked, curious. "I don't know," Ethan said, shrugging. "But maybe this guy was meant to cross your path for a reason. Maybe you're supposed to take this and do something good with it." Emily considered his words, feeling a flicker of inspiration. Maybe Ethan was right. Maybe the note wasn't just a random act of kindness. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was still light to be found. As she lay in bed that night, Emily made a promise to herself. She would hold on to the hope that the note had given her, and she would find a way to pass it on. She didn't know how yet, but she was determined to make a difference, just as that stranger had done for her. For Marcus, life went on as usual, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been part of something meaningful. He didn't know if he'd ever see the young waitress again, but he hoped that wherever she was doing better. Neither of them knew it yet, but their lives were about to become intertwined in ways they couldn't have imagined. As the days turned into weeks, Emily's life began to shift in subtle but significant ways. She started keeping the note in her pocket, a small reminder that someone had seen her struggles and believed in her. It became her talisman, a source of strength when the weight of her responsibilities threatened to pull her under. She still had bills to pay, rent to catch up on, and Ethan's medical needs to worry about, but the spark of hope inside her refused to dim. At the diner, her co-workers began to notice the change. Emily smiled more, laughed at their jokes, and even joined in on conversations during breaks. It wasn't that her problems had disappeared, far from it, but she was learning to carry them with a little more grace. Her manager, a gruff but kind-hearted woman named Diane, pulled her aside one afternoon. "Emily," Diane said, crossing her arms, "I don't know what's going on with you lately, but whatever it is, it's working. You've got this. Energy. Keep it up, kid. Emily smiled, nodding her thanks, though she didn't share the details. How could she explain that a stranger's words had reignited her hope? At home, Ethan noticed the change too. He still spent most of his days catching by the window, his illness keeping him from doing much else, but he found himself looking forward to Emily's stories from work. She talked about her customers, her co-workers, and the plans she was quietly starting to form. Ethan, ever the optimist despite his condition, encouraged her at every turn. "You've always been strong, Em," he said one evening, his voice soft but steady. "Maybe now you're starting to believe it too." But even as Emily began to rebuild her sense of self, life continued to throw challenges her way. One night, she came home to find an eviction notice taped to their door. Her heart sank as she read the words, her hands trembling. She'd been doing her best to keep up with the rent, but it hadn't been enough. They had 30 days to vacate the apartment. She didn't want to tell Ethan, but he saw the notice before she could hide it. His face fell, guilt flashing in his eyes. "This is because of me," he said quietly. "If you didn't have to take care of me, you wouldn't be in this mess." "Don't say that," Emily replied firmly, sitting beside him. "You're my brother, I love you. We'll figure this out together, okay?" Ethan nodded, though the worry in his eyes didn't fade. Emily stayed up late that night, poring over her options. She considered taking on a second job, but her current hours barely left her enough time to sleep. She thought about reaching out to social services, but the waiting lists for assistance were impossibly long. She felt the familiar weight of despair creeping in, but she refused to let it consume her. She had come too far to give up now. Meanwhile, Marcus couldn't shake the memory of the young waitress. He found himself returning to the diner more often, though he never saw her again. He didn't ask about her, worried it might come across as strange, but he kept an eye out every time he visited. He wondered if she'd read the note, if it had made any difference in her life. One evening, as he sat in his usual booth, he overheard a conversation between two of the waitresses. They were talking about Emily, their voices hushed but filled with concern. "I feel so bad for her," one of them said. "She's been working so hard, but she's got so much on her plate. I heard she's getting evicted." "Yeah," the other replied. "She's taking care of her sick brother too. I don't know how she does it." Marcus felt his chest tighten as he listened. He hadn't realized just how much she was going through. He thought about his own struggles years ago, the times when he had felt like he was drowning. It had been a stranger's kindness that had saved him then. Maybe it was his turn to pay it forward, but what could he do? He didn't know her well enough to offer direct help, and he didn't want to come across as intrusive. Still, the idea of doing nothing didn't sit right with him. He decided to start small, leaving an envelope with some cash and another note for her the next time he visited the diner. When Emily found the envelope, she was stunned. The note was simple: "For when things get tough, you're not alone." Tears welled in her eyes as she counted the money inside, enough to cover a month's rent. She looked around the diner, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had left it, but once again, he was already gone. That night, as she told Ethan about the envelope, they both felt a sense of wonder. Who was the stranger who kept appearing in their lives at just the right moments? And why did he care so much about helping them? The questions lingered, but Emily didn't have time to dwell on them. She used the money to pay their landlord, buying them a little more time to figure out their next steps. She also started looking into community resources and job opportunities, determined to build a more stable future for herself and Ethan. As Marcus continued to visit the diner, he noticed the atmosphere around Emily seemed lighter. She still carried the weight of her struggles, but there was a quiet strength in her now, a resilience that hadn't been there before. He felt a sense of pride, knowing he had played a small part in that. But the challenges weren't over yet. One day, Ethan's health took a turn for the worse, and Emily found herself rushing him to the hospital. The medical bills that followed were staggering, and for the first time in weeks, she felt the flicker of hope inside her start to dim. She didn't know how much more she could take. As she sat by Ethan's hospital bed, clutching his hand, she thought about the man who had left her the notes. She didn't know his name or where he came from, but she felt a deep sense of gratitude for his kindness. It was his words, his actions that had kept her going this far. And though she didn't know it yet, their paths were about to cross again in a way that would change everything. The hospital room was quiet, save for the steady hum of machines monitoring Ethan's condition. Emily sat by his side, her fingers lightly gripping his hand. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, and the sight of him like this broke her heart. She had always been the strong one, the one who protected him, but now she felt utterly powerless. The doctor's words echoed in her mind, a grim reminder of how serious his condition had become. Ethan needed treatment, expensive treatment, and there was no way Emily could afford it. She had already maxed out her credit cards, borrowed from friends, and worked herself to the bone. The eviction notice had been a cruel blow, but this felt like the final straw. As the hours dragged on, Emily wrestled with a growing sense of despair. She had always managed to keep going, to find a way forward, but now the path seemed blocked at every turn. She glanced at the note she had kept in her pocket, the one from the stranger at the diner. The words felt distant now, like a memory from a different life. Ethan stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering open. He looked at Emily, his gaze weak but filled with concern. "Don't cry, Em," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You're going to figure this out. You always do." Emily forced a smile, brushing a tear from her cheek. "I will," she promised, though the words felt hollow. She stayed by his side until he drifted off to sleep again, then slipped out of the room to take a break. She found herself wandering the hospital corridors, her mind racing. How was she supposed to save him when she couldn't even keep their home? Every option she considered seemed impossible, every door firmly shut. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus sat in his small apartment, staring at the envelope on his kitchen table. Inside was a substantial amount of money he had been saving for years. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to make a difference. He had been planning to use it for a trip to visit family he hadn't seen in a long time, but now he found himself hesitating. He couldn't stop thinking about Emily. He had pieced together bits of her story from the waitresses at the diner, and his heart ached for her and her brother. He knew what it was like to struggle, to feel like the weight of the world was on your shoulders, and he knew what it was like to have someone step in when you needed it most. But this was different. This wasn't just a kind note or a small gesture. This was his savings, his safety net, and giving it away felt like stepping into the unknown. Yet every time he thought about walking away, he felt a tug in his heart, a voice urging him to do something. That night, Marcus made a decision. He didn't know if it was the right one, but it was the only one that felt true to who he was. The next morning, Emily was back at the diner. She had barely slept, but she needed the hours, and being there kept her mind off Ethan's condition. She moved through her shift like a ghost, her usual resilience buried under layers of exhaustion and worry. Marcus walked in just before the lunch rush, his presence catching her off guard. She hadn't seen him in weeks, and had almost convinced herself he wouldn't come back. He sat in his usual booth, his demeanor calm but purposeful. Emily approached cautiously, forcing a polite smile. "Hi, can I get you the usual?" Marcus nodded, but his eyes held hers for a moment longer than usual. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something. When you have a minute." Her stomach tightened. She didn't know why, but something about his tone made her nervous. She nodded, finishing up with another table before returning to him. "What's on your mind?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the envelope. He slid it across the table toward her, his expression unreadable. Emily stared at it, her heart racing. "What is this?" "It's for you," Marcus said simply. "I know you're going through a lot, and I want to help." Her hands trembled as she picked up the envelope. She opened it slowly, her breath catching when she saw the money inside. It was more than she had ever seen in her life. I can't take this," she stammered, tears welling in her eyes. "This is too much." Marcus leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "You can, and you should. This isn't charity, Emily. This is one person helping another. And trust me, I've been where you are. I know how hard it is to ask for help, but sometimes you just have to let people in." Emily shook her head, overwhelmed. She wanted to refuse, to tell him she couldn't accept such a gift, but deep down she knew she needed it. This money could save Ethan, could give them a chance to start over. "But why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this for me?" Marcus hesitated, his own emotions bubbling to the surface. "Because someone once did it for me, and because I see the strength in you, even if you don't see it in yourself. You've been carrying so much, Emily. Let someone help you carry it for a while." Emily's tears spilled over as she nodded, clutching the envelope tightly. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't facing it alone. But as she left the table to compose herself, neither of them realized that the hardest part of their journey was still ahead. The money was a lifeline, but it wouldn't solve everything. And the challenges waiting for Emily and Ethan would test their resilience, and Marcus's faith in his decision, like never before. Emily sat on the bus heading home, clutching the envelope tightly against her chest. Her mind swirled with gratitude, disbelief, and a lingering sense of unease. The money was enough to pay Ethan's medical bills and cover their rent for another month, but it felt like a temporary patch on a ship riddled with holes. Still, for the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope. She whispered a silent prayer of thanks for Marcus's kindness, vowing to repay it someday. When she got home, Ethan was sitting up in bed, sketchpad in hand. His face brightened when he saw her, though the pallor in his complexion remained. She sat beside him, showing him the envelope and explaining what had happened. Ethan listened intently, his eyes widening as she recounted Marcus's words. "That's incredible," Ethan said, his voice filled with wonder. "Who is this guy, Em? He sounds like a guardian angel or something." Emily smiled faintly, but there was a shadow of doubt in her expression. "I don't know, Ethan. He's just kind. Too kind. It feels like there's more to it, but I can't figure out what." Ethan shrugged, flipping through his sketchpad. "Maybe he's just paying it forward. People can surprise you sometimes, you know." Emily wanted to believe that, but something about the situation left her unsettled. She decided to focus on the immediate task at hand, getting Ethan the care he needed. The next morning, she called the hospital to schedule his treatment, using part of the money to cover the upfront costs. It felt surreal to finally be making progress after weeks of hitting dead ends. But as the days passed, Emily began noticing strange occurrences that she couldn't explain. Once, she came home to find a bouquet of flowers on her doorstep with no note or explanation. Another time, a neighbor mentioned seeing a man lingering near their building, though they couldn't provide a clear description. At first, Emily brushed it off as a coincidence, but the unease in her gut grew stronger. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the timing felt too uncanny to ignore. She debated bringing it up to Ethan, but decided against it. He had enough to worry about. Meanwhile, Marcus was grappling with his own doubts. After giving Emily the envelope, he had felt a deep sense of purpose, as though he were fulfilling a promise to himself. But now he couldn't shake the feeling that he had overstepped. What if she felt burdened by his gesture? What if she saw him as intrusive or overly involved? One evening, he decided to stop by the diner again, hoping to gauge her reaction. But when he arrived, Emily wasn't there. One of the other waitresses told him she had taken the evening off, which was unusual for her. "She's been through a lot lately," the waitress said, her tone sympathetic. "But she's tough. She'll bounce back." Marcus nodded, but the comment only fueled his concern. He left the diner and found himself driving aimlessly, his thoughts clouded with worry. He wanted to help, but he didn't know how much was too much. That night, as Emily was preparing dinner, there was a knock at the door. She froze, her heart pounding. They rarely had visitors, and the timing felt off. She glanced at Ethan, who was sitting on the couch, then cautiously approached the door. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice steady despite the nerves coursing through her. There was a pause, then a deep voice replied, "Delivery." Emily frowned, peeking through the peephole. A man stood on the other side, holding a package. She didn't recognize him, but the logo on the box matched a local courier service. Still, something about the situation didn't feel right. She opened the door slightly, keeping the chain locked. "I didn't order anything," she said, her tone cautious. The man smiled, holding up the package. "It's a gift. No sender listed, just an address." Emily hesitated before unchaining the door and accepting the package. The man tipped his hat and walked away without another word. She closed the door quickly, her hands trembling as she set the box on the table. Ethan looked up, curiosity etched on his face. "What is it?" he asked. "I don't know," Emily replied, carefully opening the box. Inside was a small, ornate jewelry box and a handwritten note. Her pulse quickened as she unfolded the paper. The note read, "For strength in the battles ahead, you're not alone." Emily stared at the words, her mind racing. The handwriting was different from Marcus's notes, and the sentiment felt more ominous than comforting. She opened the jewelry box to find a delicate silver pendant shaped like a shield. It was beautiful, but it only deepened the mystery. "Who sent this?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with unease. "I don't know," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. The package felt like both a gift and a warning, a reminder that someone out there was watching. But who? And why? As she sat there, the pendant glinting under the dim light, a cold realization settled over her. The kindness she had received might not have come without strings. The questions swirled in her mind, each one darker than the last. And for the first time, she began to wonder if the man who had seemed like a savior might have a motive she couldn't yet see.